What happens when a woman who thinks the whole world owes her a listening ear sits across from a man who refuses to worship anyone? When Emma Watson walks into the Joe Rogan Experience expecting another soft platform to repeat her grievances, she doesn't realize she's sitting inches away from someone who calls out excuses for a living. No audience, no Hollywood handlers, just a table, two microphones, and 3 hours that spiral from awkward to explosive until Joe finally says the words no celebrity has ever heard on air. You know what, man? I'm done. We're cutting this. The studio was dim, warm, and familiar to millions who only ever saw it through their screens. The neon signs hummed softly on the brick wall, a skull on one shelf, a row of supplements on another, two microphones, two headphones, a cluttered wooden table with ashtrays, half-drunk water bottles, and a stack of Joe Rogan's notes that looked suspiciously untouched. Joe slipped his headphones on, glanced at his producer through the glass, then turned toward his guest. 3, 2, 1, and we're live. He flashed his trademark grin. Emma Watson is in the building, ladies and gentlemen. Or I should say Emma. You've been just Emma for a while now, right? Across from him, Emma adjusted her headset, jaw tight. She wore a dark sweater, expensive but deliberately casual, as if she'd tried to dress like any other podcast guest, and still ended up looking like a celebrity trying to cosplay relatable. Yes, Emma replied. I gave up the blockbusters. I've said that many times. Joe chuckled. Yeah, but you still use Hermione to get clicks, though, man. A tiny ripple of laughter came from the control room. Emma's eyes flicked toward the glass, then back to Joe. It's not my fault people don't know how to let go of labels, Emma said coolly. The name doesn't define me. Sure, Joe nodded, leaning back. So let's start there. If you don't care about the label, if you're done with the Hollywood stuff, why are you here? Why come on the biggest podcast in the world and talk about it again? There it was. First jab. Nothing cruel, just pure Rogan. Casual, disarming, but with teeth. Emma smiled without warmth. I'm here because there's still a lot people don't understand. The narrative has been twisted. I'm tired of everyone else monetizing my story. Joe raised his eyebrows. Monetizing your story? Didn't you do a major UN campaign, numerous global interviews, and several documentaries? That's called reclaiming my voice. Emma cut in, her tone already sharper. There's a difference between profiting off lies and telling your truth. Joe tilted his head. Okay, but the outcome's the same, right? Cameras, deals, attention. You walked away from acting, but walked straight into activism. That's kind of a lateral move. Emma's jaw clenched. I didn't walk into activism. I walked toward freedom. People like you love to pretend that if I speak, I must be chasing fame. I was born famous. I'm trying to survive it. Joe watched her for a moment, the way a fighter studies an opponent's stance before throwing the next punch. All right, he said, let's talk about that. You say you're surviving fame, but man, you're still doing this. You're sitting here, cameras, millions watching. There are a lot of guys out there, teachers, nurses, regular working parents who don't get one interview, let alone 10. What makes your struggle more worth hearing than theirs? Emma almost scoffed. Because my struggle exposes a system most people don't even realize exists. People see a glittering world. I live the exploitation underneath it. Joe nodded slowly, tapping the table. That's a heavy line. Exploitation. Describe it. Emma leaned forward, shoulders squaring, warming to the drama of her own language. Every move monitored, every word calculated, every relationship dissected. You're not a person. You're an emblem. Even your grief belongs to the public. When I had my public breakdown, the world commented more loudly than my own support system. The studio decided what I should feel, when I should appear, what I should say. That's not a career, Joe. That's machinery. For a brief moment, Joe's expression softened. He'd seen that look before in the eyes of soldiers, addicts, broken fighters, pain and ego tangled together. Okay, Joe said quietly. That part, I believe. Growing up under that kind of pressure, brutal. No argument. Emma relaxed a fraction. But Joe added, here's where people get hung up. You talk about that pain, but you also throw gasoline on the fire, interviews, books. You say you want privacy, but then you give the whole world front row seats to your spiritual journey. Can you see why that confuses people? Emma's eyes hardened again. Privacy? She said slowly as if teaching a child. Doesn't mean silence. It means control. I decide what I talk about. That's my right. Joe shrugged. Sure, but it also means people have the right to think, hey, this dude kind of likes the spotlight. And people have the right to be ignorant, Emma replied briskly. Your listeners are free to misunderstand me if that makes them feel better. A beat of silence. Joe blinked just once. Did you just call my listeners ignorant? Emma's mouth curled into a thin smile. I said people who don't understand nuance are ignorant. If that applies to your listeners, that's not my problem. Inside the control room, the producer mouthed the silent, "Whoa!" Joe let out a short laugh, but there was no humor in it. Okay, man, that's one way to start. He shifted in his chair, leaning in again. Let's talk about your colleague, Rupert Grint. Emma's shoulders tensed. Joe continued. In your recent press, you talked about emotional damage, shouting, feeling physically threatened. Do you regret putting that out there? Or was that another reclaiming your voice moment? Emma's gaze went flat. The only thing I regret is trusting people who never protected me, Rupert included. I didn't expose anything that wasn't already rotting underneath the surface. But he didn't write a tell-all about you, Joe pointed out. You drew first blood in public. Emma's laugh was sharp. Oh, come on, the fan fiction world has been writing books about me my entire life. I just finally responded. Funny how the world only calls it too much when I defend myself. Defend, Joe repeated, or attack. Emma's eyes flashed. Spoken like someone who's never been hunted by cameras from the age of 9. Easy to sit in your Texas studio and moralize. Joe's expression cooled. I don't moralize. I ask questions. Right, Emma snapped. Questions packaged as judgment. You're not fooling anyone. The mood in the studio shifted again, the energy thickening. Joe's show was used to heated debates. Vaccines, politics, aliens, you name it. But this was different. This wasn't two guys trading ideas over cigars. This was a woman dragging the entire weight of a cultural phenomenon into the room and daring anyone to question her version of events. Joe inhaled slowly. Look, Emma, you came here. Remember that. I didn't drag you in. You wanted this platform. I wanted an honest conversation, Emma shot back. Not another performance of, let's pretend we're neutral while we interrogate the lead actress. And I wanted a guest who doesn't automatically assume every question is an attack, Joe replied. Their eyes locked. For a brief, dangerous second, it felt less like a podcast and more like the first round of a title fight. Both fighters still on their feet, but already throwing harder than they planned. Joe broke the stare, glancing at his notes, then back at Emma. Okay, he said, let's talk, the other co-stars, because you knew it was coming. Emma's shoulders squared again. Of course, because the world still can't handle a young woman of principle navigating that family without dissecting her every breath. Joe shook his head. It's not about that for a lot of people, man. They see a pattern. Every time something goes wrong, it's the studio, the director, the institution, the male cast, the tabloids. It's never you, Emma's reply came low and icy. That's because we're not the problem. Joe's fingers drummed lightly on the table. Yeah, he said softly. We'll see what people think after they hear the rest of this. And somewhere in that sentence, in that casual challenge, something in Emma's expression shifted from defensive to dangerous, as if she'd decided this wasn't an interview anymore. It was a battleground, and she had just declared war on the host. The air inside the studio had shifted, thick, electric, almost humming with an invisible voltage. The neon lights behind Joe flickered subtly, as if reacting to the tension between the two men. Joe sat back in his chair, elbows on the armrests, fingers interlaced. Across from him, Emma leaned forward, arms crossed, jaw tight, wearing the expression of someone who believed she was being persecuted rather than interviewed. Joe cleared his throat. All right, he said calmly. We were talking about the co-stars. You said people dissect her every breath. But I want to ask something simple. Do you think any criticism of them is valid? Or is every negative story automatically part of some conspiracy? Emma inhaled sharply, eyes narrowing. When you're dealing with a system as powerful and misunderstood as the acting industry, she began, her tone dripping with superiority. Criticism is rarely about facts. It's about jealousy, ignorance, and misogyny. Joe rubbed his forehead. Man, that's a heavy generalization. You're telling me millions of people across different countries all have the same motives? Millions of uninformed people? Emma shrugged. Yes, it happens. Joe gave a single tired laugh. You hear how that sounds, right? Like you think everyone who doesn't agree with you is beneath you. Emma smirked. If they're repeating tabloid nonsense, then yes, they are. Inside the control room, the producer muttered under his breath, "He's unbelievable." Joe leaned in again. Listen, dude, not everyone who disagrees with you hates you. Sometimes people just point out contradictions, like how you moved away from acting for a simpler life, but ended up doing documentaries, interviews, podcasts. Emma cut him off, voice rising just a notch. You don't get to lecture me about my choices. Privacy doesn't mean hiding. It means choosing how much access you give people. Joe nodded slowly. Okay, so let me ask you this directly. If you hate the press, Suman, if you think the industry is toxic, if you want control, then why do you keep doing interviews? Emma didn't hesitate. Because I deserve to be heard. My story deserves space, and frankly, people like you need to hear it. Joe blinked. People like me. Emma tilted her head, her smile sharpening. Yes, Joe. People who sit in soundproof studios judging folks who actually live through trauma. People who think a few UFC fights and a Spotify contract qualify them to analyze a decade of a global franchise. Joe's eyebrows climbed. Damn, he murmured. That's something. But Emma wasn't done. You want to dissect my career, my decisions, my relationships, but you've never experienced anything close to my reality. You talk about humility, but you expect me to bow to you in this room. Joe leaned back, arms spread. Emma, I don't expect you to bow to anybody. I'm literally sitting here having a conversation. You're the one turning it into a firefight. Emma scoffed. Maybe because you're not used to interviewing someone who challenges you. Joe nodded. True, usually my guests don't insult my audience. Emma shrugged. Maybe your audience should toughen up. A sharp exhale came from behind the glass. Even the air conditioning sounded louder. Joe held up a hand. All right, let's shift again. Talk to me about Rupert. No drama, just a straight question. When's the last time you spoke to him? Emma's lips pulled into a tight line. Why should I answer that? Because you wrote about him in your essays, Joe replied. Because you've spoken about him in interviews. Because the world is curious, man. Emma rolled her eyes. The world is always curious. The world always wants more from me. They want details, conflict, pain, and people like you feed that appetite. Joe nodded. Maybe, but you feed it too. You brought him up. You said he acted aggressively toward you, threatened you. Do you stand by all that? Emma's eyes flared. Every word. And you don't see how putting that out publicly might have, I don't know, made reconciliation harder. Emma stiffened. Reconciliation isn't possible when one side refuses to acknowledge their wrongdoing. But forgiveness doesn't come with conditions, Joe replied. Sometimes you give it even if the other person doesn't say sorry, Emma snapped. I'm not Jesus, Joe. I'm not here to be saintly. I'm here to protect myself. Joe opened his hands again. Protect yourself or punish them. Emma's tone dropped colder than before. Punish. I don't punish. I reveal. If the truth hurts them, that's their burden. Joe rubbed his face, exasperated. Man, has anyone in your life ever told you maybe you're part of the problem? Emma bristled instantly. That's what weak people say when they can't accept the truth. There it was, the line that made even Joe lean back and stare. Wow, Joe whispered. So now anyone who questions you is weak. Emma didn't blink. If the shoe fits, Joe's jaw tightened. This was the moment the dynamic shifted, when the host stopped seeing a guest and started seeing a runaway ego spiraling out of control. He sighed heavily. Okay, all right, let's talk about something else before this turns into a shouting match. Emma smirked. It already has. You just don't want to admit you're losing control of your own show. The control room froze. Joe's eyes narrowed. Oh, he said quietly. You think that's what's happening here? Emma shrugged again, settled back in her chair, arms crossed. I've dealt with tougher interrogations. If this is the best you've got, I'm not impressed. Joe stared at her for a long moment, lips pressed together as he slowly inhaled through his nose. And for the first time in the entire interview, Joe Rogan looked genuinely irritated. The studio air had become thick enough to cut with a knife. Joe Rogan sat in silence for a moment, leaning back in his chair, trying to calibrate himself before things spiraled completely out of control. The producers behind the glass were frozen, staring at the monitors like they were watching a car crash in slow motion. Emma, however, looked perfectly satisfied, chin lifted, arms crossed, wearing the smug expression of someone who believes she just scored a point in an argument that hadn't even started. Joe exhaled through his nose. "All right," he said carefully. "Let's get back on track," Emma smirked. "I didn't realize we left the track." Joe ignored the jab. "So Emma, let me ask you something about responsibility." "Responsibility?" Emma repeated with an amused scoff. "That's rich coming from you." Joe held up a hand. "Dude, this isn't a sparring match. I'm just trying to have a conversation." Emma leaned forward, voice sharp. "No, Joe. You're trying to corner me. Same tactic as everyone else. Ask a loaded question. Wait for me to react, then act surprised." Joe closed his eyes for half a second. "Okay, forget responsibility. Let's talk about the public image." Emma's expression shifted instantly, pride mixed with irritation. Joe continued, "In your recent statements, you revealed some seriously personal stuff about your co-stars, your childhood, even your mental health situation." A few quiet chuckles leaked from the crew. Emma glared in their direction. Joe pressed on. "Do you regret sharing any of that now that some time has passed?" Emma answered with icy confidence. "No, everything I wrote needed to be said." Joe raised his brows. "Even the part about the arguments on set over your activism." Emma's jaw tightened. "Yes, especially that part, and the behind-the-scenes drama." "Joe," Emma snapped, "if you're going to mock my trauma, this conversation is over." Joe's voice stayed calm. "I'm not mocking anything. I'm asking if maybe, just maybe, you overshared." Emma scoffed loudly. "Overshared? That's the problem with the world. Everyone's too sensitive. How else was I supposed to tell my story? Whisper it to myself in the mirror." Joe leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "No one's asking you to hide. But there's a difference between being open and dumping every private detail to the public." Emma shrugged. "The public deserves the truth." Joe blinked. "Dude, the public doesn't deserve anything from your professional life." Emma barked a laugh. Says the man whose entire career is based on broadcasting conversations. Behind the glass, one of the producers whispered, "She's unreal." Joe fought the urge to roll his eyes. "Look, man, you keep calling yourself a truth teller. You say you're free, but honestly, you sound angry. You sound bitter." Emma leaned back, crossing her legs like a queen on a throne. "I am enlightened, Joe. That's why it irritates people like you. I don't play by your rules." Joe gestured around the room. "You're literally playing by my rules right now. This is my studio." Emma smirked. "And yet you seem threatened." Joe paused. It was subtle, but that sentence, "and yet you seem threatened," snapped something unspoken in the room. Joe slowly set his headphones down. "Threatened?" he repeated softly. "By you?" Emma shrugged. "You're getting flustered." Joe blinked slowly. "All right, let's talk about Rupert again." Emma's face darkened instantly. "No," the word came sharp and stiff. "That topic is closed." Joe pressed gently. "Why? You've been open about everything else," Emma growled under her breath. "Because I'm tired of you people asking me the same questions. Rupert this, Rupert that. Maybe talk about my achievements for once." Joe gave him a long, incredulous stare. "Okay, what achievement would you like to talk about?" Emma hesitated for a second, just long enough for Joe to notice. Then Emma snapped. "You wouldn't understand." Joe leaned back, folding his arms. "Try me." Emma straightened in her seat, posture stiff, chin high. "I've built a global platform. I've redefined what it means to be a modern feminist activist. I've exposed systemic sexism. I've inspired millions." Joe stared at her. "Did you, though?" Emma's nostrils flared. "What's that supposed to mean?" Joe kept his voice even. "I mean, when people think of you now, they don't talk about your accomplishments. They talk about the interviews, the drama, the fights, the complaints." Emma pointed a finger at him because the media twisted everything. Joe lifted his hands. I'm not the media. I'm one guy asking you questions you agreed to answer. Emma rolled her eyes again. You Americans are all the same. That was it. The room shifted. Everyone felt it. Joe leaned in, voice dropping lower. What's that supposed to mean? Emma shrugged casually. Blind celebrity worship, loud opinions, no understanding of real social justice. You idolize wealth and pretend it makes you important. Joe blinked once, twice. Then he sat back in his chair, his tone suddenly colder. Emma, be careful. Emma chuckled arrogantly. Careful of what? You. Joe didn't smile. No, careful you don't lose whatever sympathy you have left. Emma flicked a hand dismissively. I don't need sympathy from the masses. The control room froze. Two camera operators stiffened. A silence slammed down like a hammer. Joe slowly leaned forward. The masses? He repeated, almost whispering. That what you think of people? Emma's smirk didn't fade. If the word fits, Joe inhaled deeply. You do realize you're not at a UN conference, right? You're in Texas in my studio with my team, with regular people. Emma shrugged, and Joe lowered his voice to a near growl. You're not doing yourself any favors, man. Emma laughed softly. I don't need favors. I'm Emma Watson. And for a second, just a second, Joe looked like he was genuinely considering ending the interview right then and there. But instead he said, let's take a break. Emma smirked triumphantly. I thought you'd say that. Joe didn't reply. He just stood up and walked off camera. For the first time in the entire interview, Emma's smirk wavered. The break felt like an hour, though it lasted barely 4 minutes. The studio pulsed with a different kind of energy now. Not tension, but anticipation. The crew whispered among themselves, stealing glances at Emma, who sat alone at the table. Still perfectly smug, still tapping her fingers like she was waiting for assistants to return with organic tea. But Joe Rogan was nowhere near that table. He stood just off camera, arms crossed, talking quietly with a producer who looked pale. You sure you want to finish this? The producer whispered. Joe exhaled through his nose, eyes fixed on Emma. We're finishing this, he said, but on my terms. When he walked back toward the table, the change in him was visible. He wasn't the relaxed, laughing host anymore. This Joe Rogan was still calm, but in the way a storm is calm right before it hits. He sat down, adjusted his mic, and stared at Emma for a long moment. We good? He asked. Emma smirked. I don't know, Joe. Are you good? You seemed awfully flustered before. Joe ignored the provocation. Let's keep going. The cameras flicked back on. Joe leaned forward. Emma, before the break, you called the public the masses. You understand how Emma cut him off with a scoff. Oh, for God's sake. You Americans can't take a joke. It was sarcasm, Joe. Joe raised a brow. You said it 3 times. Emma flicked a hand. Well, some truths slip out when one's exhausted. Joe stared at her. So you meant it, Emma's eyes narrowed. I think people need to stop being so dramatic about words, Joe pressed. And you don't see how calling ordinary people the masses might reflect badly on you. Emma leaned back with theatrical boredom. If people are offended, maybe they should examine why the word fits. A couple of crew members exchanged stunned looks. One whispered, she's digging her own grave. Joe exhaled deeply, too deeply. Emma, do you hear yourself? Emma shrugged. I hear someone speaking honestly, something the world clearly isn't used to. Joe's patience thinned visibly. All right, let's talk about the constant media scrutiny. Emma's eyes sharpened instantly, voice turning defensive. What about the scrutiny? Joe stayed calm. There have been rumors. Emma leaned forward sharply. Rumors you will not repeat. Joe didn't flinch. You came here to talk, Emma. I talk to everyone the same way. Musicians, comedians, presidents. If there's something big in the news, then ignore it, Emma snapped. Stop feeding the tabloids' obsession with my private life. Joe folded his hands. I'm not feeding anything. I'm asking questions. It's what a host does. Emma gave a cold laugh. No, Joe. What you're doing is trying to corner me for entertainment. You want a moment. You want a meltdown. That's why I shouldn't have come back. Then why did you come back? Joe asked, tone suddenly sharper. Emma froze. Joe stared her down. Seriously, if all you do is blame everyone around you, why show up? Emma straightened, nostrils flaring. Because people deserve to hear my truth. At that, Joe actually laughed, a short, humorless exhale. Man, every time you say that, you sound less like a truth teller and more like someone who can't stand being questioned. Emma's jaw clenched. I won't be disrespected by mediocrity, Joe. Joe's eyes snapped up. The room froze. Mediocrity, Joe repeated slowly. Emma lifted her chin. Don't act surprised. You're not exactly interviewing world leaders. Joe leaned in, voice low. I've interviewed astronauts, neuroscientists, war heroes, philosophers, and legends. But I've never had someone sit here, insult everyone in the room, and act like the world owes her something. Emma smirked. The world does owe me something. Joe stared at her, stunned. You serious? Emma lifted both hands. I was born into duty, into expectations, into a system that suffocated me. The least people can do is understand my pain. Joe blinked slowly. Emma, you're living in a mansion in Hollywood. Emma shrugged. And does comfort erase pain? You Americans are so obsessed with money. You equate wealth with happiness. It's pathetic. Honestly, Joe inhaled through his teeth. Okay, enough. Emma smirked. Touch a nerve. Joe sat forward, elbows on the table, voice deadly calm. You called people the masses. You insulted my staff. You trashed the audience. You mocked Americans. You insulted me. Emma's smile widened. So, Joe repeated, incredulous. So you're lucky anyone even listens to you anymore. Emma scoffed. Please, the world hangs on my every word. Joe shook his head. No, man, they watch you the way people watch a building about to collapse. Emma's face hardened. Enough, Joe. Joe didn't stop. You know the difference between you and every other guest I've had on this show. Even when people disagree with me, there's mutual respect. But you came in here acting like you're above basic decency. Emma stood up abruptly. There it was. The crack. Don't talk to me like that, Emma snapped. I am Emma Watson. Joe stood up too. No, you're Emma, just Emma. A woman sitting in my studio acting like the world owes her reverence. Emma pointed at him. You're crossing a line. Joe took one step closer, voice final. No, you crossed every line 10 minutes into this interview. Emma's eyes flared. Are you threatening me? Joe shook his head. I'm ending this. Emma blinked, stunned. Ending? What do you mean ending? Joe pointed toward the exit. This interview is over. Emma's mouth fell open. You're kicking me out. Joe stared at her. This isn't the Met Gala. This isn't the BBC press corps. This is my studio, my show, and you don't get to disrespect everyone here and walk away like a hero. Emma sputtered, voice rising. You can't do that. I came here to lecture the world, Joe snapped. To insult people, to play the victim again? Emma froze. Joe lowered his voice, but the intensity remained. You came here looking for a fight. Congratulations. You found the wrong guy. Emma shook with rage. You'll regret this, Rogan. Joe shrugged. Maybe, but right now you need to leave. Emma ripped off her mic, slamming it on the table, and stormed out of the studio. Not with dignity, not with grace, but with the fury of a woman who had lost control of the narrative. The moment the door shut behind her, the room exhaled collectively. Joe sat back down, rubbing his temples. Well, he muttered to the camera, that was something. Then he looked straight into the lens. Emma wanted a platform. She got one. But platforms don't protect you from the truth. Fade to black. If you enjoyed this unbelievable clash between Emma Watson and Joe Rogan, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications because more shocking confrontations, exposed egos, and behind-the-scenes drama are coming your way. Drop a comment below and tell us whose side you're on.